Here at the Maritime Institute of Technology and Graduate Studies near Baltimore, Maryland, every day we talk about issues that are important not only to U.S. mariners, but also mariners across the globe. You'd expect conversations about issues important to mariners and U.S. mariners to be happening here. What's interesting is that these are also happening among leading academics at universities and colleges across the country. China's assertive actions in the South China Sea have sparked much of the debate about shipping and our nation's military and economic security. In this installment of Notice to Mariners, we're going to talk to two professors at Hawaii Pacific University, Dr. Patrick Bratton and Captain Carl Schuster, who have written a report entitled Sea Strangulation that makes a compelling case for strengthening the U.S. merchant marine.
Really what we were looking at is the vulnerability that the United States seemed to be facing in terms of its merchant marine shipping, because the U.S. merchant marine is a shadow of what it used to be. One of the other goals that we would have is not to take this security for granted, not to take the sort of level of maritime security that the United States has enjoyed for the past 50 years, that this is just a constant, will always be there. Because I think we're moving into a new world where other countries, other actors would like to seek to challenge certain aspects of this sort of U.S. regime that exists, and part of the way that would be done is through maritime.
Most people think of these things in a purely military dimension. There's actually many more dimensions in modern security affairs than military. For example, economic leverage.
We tend to forget that, over 90% of our trade or goods is coming in by the ocean. It's very important, particularly for overseas territories, but also for the U.S. mainland, and also particularly for power projection of U.S. forces.
Your ability to move your products, services, and logistics support for your military is dependent upon your ability to control the shipping. When we looked at what's happening with the American Merchant Marine, there are all types of critics of the Jones Act, and they focus on consumer prices. And that's a legitimate focus, if you will, but unfortunately national security follows far beyond that. And we have gone to a situation where we don't control the vast majority of American goods, services, and support elements that we ship around the world. And that's had bad consequences. For example, we have a Maverick missile sitting in Cuba now. And it wound up in Cuba because we relied on foreign shippers.
If the United States attempts to use sort of foreign flagged ships of convenience, all sorts of difficulties are potential. And we've seen that in the past as well. When Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara tried to use foreign flagged ships in Vietnam, if those countries are not in agreement with U.S. policy, they could forbid that. The few policies that we have in place that protect the merchant marine and then also protect sort of maritime security, like the Maritime Security Program, are quite vital to this. They maintain a sort of a bare minimum, if you will, for the United States to supply troops and military forces overseas. When we think about maritime interdiction or sea strangulation, I think one of the problems is that we conceptualize this in a traditional sort of military sense, sort of the U-boats in World War I or World War II. It's not necessary to destroy commerce sort of, at the point of a gun. What you need to do is disrupt it. And so potentially the vulnerability for sea strangulation will happen at a level far below that of war.
China has already declared the 9-dash line of the South China Sea to be territorial waters. In terms of monetary value, 30% of the world's maritime trade transits through those waters.
There are these ways of exerting pressure, and we've seen China do that in the South China Sea as well. Whether it's building up these artificial islands, it's declaring air defense identification zones. Over 90% of Chinese shipping goes on Chinese ships rather than flags of convenience. And a lot of the Chinese sailors are trained, in a sense, for military operations.
China's merchant marine is growing, and they're beginning to apply it to military activities. They ram and sink Vietnamese fishing boats almost daily. If you can deny freedom of navigation to one country, and there are no objections, then freedom of navigation ultimately can be denied to all the countries. We need to have all the tools required to contest that and deter that. And that means freedom of navigation operations with ships, but it also means having a mercantile backup, and that means sufficient merchant ships to make that 22-day voyage with a minimum delivery of up to 100,000 tons of material a week, and that means a lot of ships. That's twice as many as we currently have. We've taken for granted that we'll always be number one, and the reality is staying number one in sports, in national power, in any endeavor requires constant reinvestment, constant attention to all the foundation elements, and that's what we need to get back to.
Now we go from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Rear Admiral Christopher McMahon at the U.S. Naval War College has recently published a paper about the U.S. Merchant Marine and its future.
The purpose of the paper is really to answer the question, why should we have a U.S. flag merchant marine? And if you go back to the founding fathers, they recognized immediately the importance of having us independence from Great Britain at the time. And in order to do that, they created incentives to support a U.S. flag merchant marine. Now, because the United States is, if not the #1 trading nation on earth, it's certainly up there with China and the top few. So we depend upon the seas and on commercial sea lift for global trade. That trade is moving on foreign ships. And in my view, from a business perspective, if you do not have at least some dog in the game, you have a vulnerability. Historically, there have been times, you have to go back to World War I, and actually there was the decades or so around from the 1890s where the foreign carriers, for different reasons, pulled their ships out of the U.S. market. And at that time, the U.S. was a major exporter. So we had agricultural goods and manufacturing goods in the warehouses ready to be delivered, and there was no one to deliver them because we didn't have any ships. Now, again, people say, well, that was a long time ago, it's a century ago, that's never going to happen again. That's ridiculous. I mean, we have to prepare the United States for any potential contingency. And again, when you have a strategic industry and you don't have a plan B, you're going to have a problem. You hear attacks on the Jones Act all the time. I mean, people think that, gee, you know, you've got this industry that is protected. You can't, if you go from an American port to American port, you have to go on an American ship. Why? Because the Jones Act says. And why is that there? Because it wants to protect the industry, because the industry has a strategic value to the United States. I would argue the Jones Act exists because it has a strategic value to the United States. And unfortunately, those that criticize it think it's a really expensive law, and the average consumer, it raises the cost of gasoline and everything else. That's just not true. If you did an honest analysis, it would be so small as to be absolutely insignificant, and yet it has a major impact on the strategic merchant marine in terms of supplying jobs for mariners, so they can crew up our ready reserve fleet, that they're available for strategic sea lift in national emergencies. So I think we need to have more U.S. flag ships for economic reasons as well as strategic reasons, both.
It's clear from this research that there's an overdependence on foreign flag of convenience vessels. It's really important that the United States have security, not only militarily, but economically. It's time to boost the U.S. Merchant Marine and protect our country. We hope you found this video informative. Thank you for your time. Let us know what you think, and stay tuned.